All right, everybody. Hello. So excited to be here face to face. I recognize many of you from the first year. So glad that you're back. I am really excited to introduce this project. It's something that I think is going to be fantastic. This is the 1519 project, the Gullah Geechee origins of African, or 1560.
It's all right. We probably do it a couple times.
Pardon. The 1526 project, the Gullah Geechee origins of African American history and cultures of resistance. It is my great honor to introduce Corey Claiborne, Associate Professor of English at Morehouse College. We should all give her a big round of applause. Thank you.
Okay, I bring you greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, and the Atlanta University Center, which is home to Clark Atlanta University, Spelman College, Morehouse College, and the International Theological Seminary. So we are so glad to be here today. We're gonna, and my colleagues unfortunately couldn't be here, but I think we're gonna have a really good discussion. And we wanna talk about, really, I think that the background to this project is thinking about really the uses of history, right? I think we're in a moment where there's a lot of debate about that, right? And a lot of people know about the 1619 project, which Cole Hannah-Jones, began, and she's developed into a book, into a children's book. It's going to be a documentary series, all these other kind of things. And well, I think that what 1619 does is open up a new avenue to really sort of talk about what we know about American history. And for African Americans, I always like to tell my students that slavery began and ended in South Carolina, right? And a lot of times they don't understand that, or they don't know that, right? So they'll know about Point Comfort in 1619 and about, the Angolans who were first enslaved there. They know very little about the 100 years that preceded that in 1526 and the 100 Africans that were brought here by the Spanish to South Carolina and Georgia, and what that sort of means, because those Africans ultimately led a slave revolt and rebelled, right? So the history of Africans in the United States does begin with revolution, right? Which is really what America is about. We have a very revolutionary spirit. So I think it's important to know about those 100 Africans. And I was really excited to know and hear about the archaeological research that's going on, because I do think, and I'm hoping that there is going to be more 16th century sort of digging into finding early sediments of Native Americans and Africans, and really sort of bringing out that story. So to that end, I want to introduce our project, the 1526 project, the Gullah Geechee origins of African American history and cultures of resistance. And I'm going to introduce the panelists. First is going to be Sam Livingston, who really is the editor of our collection. This is kind of his, brainchild. And he is currently a professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse. And he's going to really sort of set the stage for what led to this collection, the 1526 project. Then we're going to talk about Karshik Sims Alvarado and her work, The Exodus, which is African American immigration in Reconstruction era Georgia, and the search for freedom abroad. And remember, making the linkages between earlier Africans and African in other eras. Then I'm going to talk about the water, and my piece is called The Water Always Remembers, Stories of Origin and Rebellion in South Carolina. Then we have Natasha Walker, who is an English professor at Morehouse as well, and she's going to talk about Gullah spirituality and healing, and Gloria Naylor's Mama Day. Then we have Carrie Dennison Elliott, who is an independent researcher, and she's going to talk about, from these roots, Afro-Nubian origins of Gullah Geechee resistance and community organization. Ifitayo Ojalade is going to talk about root work and conjure, which is always interesting. And then Stephanie Dunn is going to complete our preview, because there are many other chapters that Dr. Livingston will talk about, but Stephanie Dunn is the director of the Cinema, Media, and cinema, television, and emerging media studies. And she's also a professor of creative writing and an author. So she's gonna talk and finish up talking about Gullah cultural aesthetics and the moving image as a visual archive of resistance. So to that end, I'm gonna hand it off. And I just wanna say a little bit about this picture. We started, Sam and I at Morehouse, a class on the Gullah Geechee experience. So we started this in 2015. This was the first class of students. We take the students on a tour. So not only do they learn like in an interdisciplinary fashion from literature and religion and politics and culture about Gullah culture, but we actually took the students from, starting basically from Sandy Island, Georgetown, down to St. Helena. So this was the group at the Penn Center. And Simeon Days, he was our honorary student, like in the middle. He joined us for that, experience, but it has been an experience that has grown like each year. And so what we've understood from the class is that people are interested in this work. Students need to know about this history as it relates to Gullah Geechee culture and African-American culture. So we'll start with Dr. Livingston here.
All right, Dr. Claiborne, Corey, thank you so much. My apologies for not being able to be there. And my thanks especially, like I said, to Dr. Claiborne for representing this large research project and putting a face to the 1526 project. It's great to see so many people here. That is phenomenal. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here. I understand that it's beautiful in the Grand Strand right now. So we'll go ahead and just get started. So just as the good thing is that, like she always does, Dr. Claiborne really has set up the 1526 project very well. So we'll talk about the purpose and give an overview of the contributing authors, the organization of the text, spend a second with that, and then the featured chapters. And then I'll just go directly into one of the chapters that I'm working on with actually a former student of mine, Mr. Casey Fenor, who's a Haitian American student. And I should say researcher, because he's no longer my student. All right, okay, sorry, I'm gonna try not to jump around. My apologies. All right, here we go. Let's go ahead and get started. So our feature chapters, Corey has already talked about that, so I'm not gonna spend time reintroducing those. But the good thing is that this will be available to everyone. So if you're interested, you can reach out. And I think we have provided our social media handles. So if you want to reach out and have a little bit of dialogue about what we're doing, we'd love to have that, okay? So we're lucky enough to have 5 of our presenters here today. Did I have that right? And Dr. Sims Alvarado is not here today, but I'll give an overview of her presentation. This work, the book project in general, is dedicated to our elders and to our ancestors. And we say all of our African Gullah Geechee ancestors and elders, but 2 in particular. One, Miss Gloria Barr Ford, she's my aunt. She's a Gullah oral traditionalist who's just retired from being a cultural interpreter at, I want to say it's the Middleton Plantation. Corey, you can correct me on that, in Charleston. But she still gathers research and does research on Gullah culture. And in many ways, I wouldn't be doing this work without her. And also to Mr. Alexander Rodriguez and to his wife, who is now an ancestor, Miss Bunny Rodriguez, both of who founded the Gullah Woman Cultural Museum in Georgetown. It's a very small museum, but it's packed with so much material. And so yeah, I won't spend too much time. I think about a couple of conversations with Mr. Rodriguez and how he essentially showed me that there's a way to integrate, an Africana Studies and an African-centered perspective, and to look at Gullah culture as well. And of course, our ancestors. My mother, Shirley Barr Livingston, passed away in 2006. Of course, taught all of us, not just me, but my cousin Carrie and my brothers and all cousins, so much about our Gullah heritage, and took great pride in that. Our grandparents, Reverend Sam Barr, my grandmother, Rosabelle Barr, and many others, all who are here, present with us, and we invite them in this space, absolutely. So let's go ahead. The purpose of this text is to develop a text for the course, and I don't know if you can actually see this. My screen is a little bit over this. Let's see if I can move this. Okay, here we go. Yeah, that's better. For the course, the Gullah Geechee experience, which is AFR 360, an interdisciplinary approach. The text, it explores African-centered and countercultural narratives, major holes in the scholarly literature, all concerning the role of Gullah Geechee people in the founding of African-American cultures of resistance in the context of Afro-Caribbean and Pan-African history. And if you do that, if you touch on Caribbean and the Pan-African aspect, it makes it a global history. I love this image right here because this is what we're trying to do. The person that you see standing right here is Mr. Darren Calhoun. The second, he is, I think, the director, for community outreach at the Avery Center in the College of Charleston. And what he has done in a couple of opportunities, I think there were a couple of years where they were actually closed, but what you see him doing right here is leading a guided discussion of different artifacts and primary source photos at the Avery Research Center. And so Darren graduated from Morehouse. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna blank, but I think it's like 2012. He'll kill me for that if I get that wrong, but he's here guiding current Morehouse and Spelman students. That you see, Brianna was a Spelman student, and all the students here basically really benefited from that guided discussion. And it showed them that there's a systematic and serious, structured way to investigate Gullah cultures. Within the context of the course as a whole, it really provided a nice opportunity to show the interdisciplinary nature of Gullah studies and within an Africana Studies context. So the book will fit in that it'll help to basically consider three relatively novel theses. And I say relatively novel because, as we know, there's nothing new under the sun. The more you do research, you find out it's like, oh, somebody else was doing this in the late 1800s or the early 1900s. And that's a good thing. That's a great thing. But we want to take up three primary broad theses, and you'll see these reverberating throughout the presentations. First, that African intellectual and cultural capital was influential in the realm of liberation thinking and praxis, forming a nexus linking diasporic patterns of resistance. Long story short, basically, we tend to think about African culture as a source of food and a source of clothing and dress and music, but we don't think about it in terms of ideologies and philosophies. So we're actually turning that and investigating that particular area in the book project in particular. And there are a couple of chapters that actually do that. Second, that African-American exploitation is predicated on a pre-existing Iberian and Latin political economic system and socio-political patterns of resistance, or socio-political patterns, excuse me. Not just the English. The English, sure, you're right. And with the 1619 Project and moving forward, English were definitely some of the architects of slavery, but the people who really pioneered this, and of course it's not a good thing, of course, were the Portuguese and the Spaniards. And their experience on the islands of Hispaniola and what would become Cuba would be Puerto Rico and other areas would be foundational. In fact, the first 100 Africans will be brought from Hispaniola. The first 100 Africans in 1526 brought to what would become the United States were brought from Hispaniola. But that's clear. Sorry, one click and it goes all over the place. And then third, the relationship between Africans and Native Americans. which of course deserves much more attention and interdisciplinary research in the realms of cultures of resistance. So this book project, in some ways, it synthesizes research, but it also is providing new research as well. Okay, so the book is organized into three main sections: an introduction, which me and Dr. Dunn have written and probably will rewrite, and as we're in that revision process. So we provide a context for the text. Part one looks at histories of resistance, works by Dr. Fred Knight, who's the author of Working the Diaspora, and also a Morehouse professor. Dr. Kaushik Sims Alvarado, who couldn't be here with us, looking at repatriation efforts from the Low Country. And then I contribute a chapter two, looking at the foundation story. There was 100 Africans who rebelled at San Miguel del Guadape, and the connection, the relationship between Haitian revolutionary thought and Gullah Geechee ideologies of resistance. So the connection between those. And then part two looks at Gullah Geechee socio-political patterns. And you'll actually see a couple of the chapters there. And then part three, which provides the bulk of our literature, the bulk of our chapters, really looks at Gullah Geechee literatures of resistance. And I think those are some of the most fascinating. All of them are fascinating, but I really appreciate those literary explorations and cultural explorations as well. Okay, so just giving you examples there. Okay, so of course, Dr. Dennison Elliott is here. Darren couldn't be here. And then our literature chapters, Dr. Claiborne, Dr. Walker, Dr. Ojelado, Ifetayo, don't hit me, Ifetayo Ojelade, and Dr. Dunn is here as well. Okay, so I'll be very brief so we can move on to and give time for all of our presenters. The chapter that I wanted to present today, actually, I shared in 2019, the last time that we met with the EGOT conference. But that project has grown. The more you do research, you find more material. The chapter is going to be titled, the Expanding the Circle of Culture, Africana Cultural Currents in the Haitian and Gullah Geechee Social Contracts from 1526 to 1865. And I wanted to really, this image is of a picture that I took in Haiti at a small village called Ville de Pamis, which is maybe 45 miles west of Port-au-Prince, but it's up a mountain, and a real mountain, which we all learned and came to appreciate. But we did some work with this community, and we look forward to being able to go back and have more conversations. And probably these little guys right here will be all grown up if they're still in the village. But I wanted to raise the question. We know, when we consider, we know something about who the people were that actually populated the Gullah Geechee and the Haitian communities. We look at slavevoyages.org, the digital archive, the database, and we see, of course, a pattern that is clear. Within this colony of Virginia, you see the bite of Biafra constituting the greatest plurality of enslaved Africans, with 43% of Africans being brought from that area. And then with about 16% coming from West Central Africa. But in South Carolina, in Georgia, if you actually look at those two together, the biggest plurality is from West Central Africa. It's from the Congo Angolan groups being brought into the US. Okay, and then the second largest plurality are Senegambians. That is similar, but a little bit different from what happens in Hispaniola. In Hispaniola, the greatest plurality, the actual majority of enslaved Africans come from West Central Africa. We think that this is one of the reasons why the Haitian Revolution was successful, was that you had so many African people, some of whom were soldiers, who were brought from areas where there was they were conversant in each other's languages, or they spoke the same language, and some of whom might have actually served in similar military companies. When you look at the literature from the 18th centuries and 19th century about the Haitian Revolution, you quite often will see the troops, the broad army, referred to as the Congos, because so many Africans were brought from that area. Now, so what we raise in this chapter, though, is the question of how do these different folks, different people from different ethnic groups, enslaved Africans from different ethnic groups, become a unified group? And what we take up is a thesis that's laid out by first Sterling Stuckey, who argues in his book, Slave Culture. Sterling Stuckey is probably one of 2 or 3 mentors of mine who that I never took a class with. Let me see if they're probably rushing me along because I know I have to hurry up. But this is a depiction from Cap Haitian in the North Coast. And this is one of the few depictions of the Bois Cayman ceremony that actually shows the Bois Cayman ceremony looking very much like a ring shout. And if you know the work of Sterling Stuckey, you know that he argues that the ring shout, storytelling, musical traditions, healing traditions, all formed a part of the cultural nexus that united African people and helped them to become a united African people in the Americas. So moving on, we see, well, I will just say one thing. A couple of things that you'll notice in this painting, very beautiful painting, is the clockwise motion, counterclockwise motion of the dancers in the voting ceremony, of what they call the Bois Cayman ceremony, which is very, very important. But we also have to take a look at, in this chapter, it's going to look at culture, but it's also going to look at statecraft. And we're going to take up the thesis of Dr. Deborah Jensen, who in her book, Beyond the Slave Narrative, argues that Haiti is significant because it actually stretches beyond the mode, the genre of the slave narrative. And you actually see Black men and women writing from the perspective of statecraft. They're building states, they're building nations. But we also want to put that in conversation with these cultural practices as well. And I'm coming to an end, I promise. Let's see, here we go, okay. All right, so in addition to the cultural practices and the visual cultural arts that are very vivid in Gullah Geechee people today and Haitian people today, we're going to look at some primary sources. And I love the work of 2 books in particular. Well, couple of books, but just to be quick, Deborah Jensen's work, which we already mentioned, but then also Dr. Julius S. Scott, who made transition to the realm of the ancestors just this last year, his book, The Common Wind. Both of those look at the way that Black people are talking about revolution and spreading the word of revolution in ways that really trouble the notion that enslaved Africans were bound to a particular plantation and location in terms of the knowledge that they possess. So this quote from Jean-Jacques Dessalines, I think, is very interesting. The conclusion of that quote basically just brings the idea forward. He calls on the Haitian people. He says, I reject that awful idea that you deserve the fate that you experienced during enslavement. And he calls on them. He says, therefore vow before me to live free and independent and to prefer death to anything that will try to place you back in chains. Swear finally to pursue forever the traitors and enemies of your independence, to stand it. Now, what's interesting is that, as Jensen shows, this wasn't just written to the Haitian people. It was actually put in newspapers in the United States of America and in France. They were writing to a broader audience that was not just white, but also Blacks in the United States. So we're going to take up that idea of what was the effect of actually having these Black people, Black revolutionaries, spreading revolutionary ideas in newspapers in the 18th and 19th centuries. So Jensen's idea is very, very good. And again, putting the work of Carolyn Fick and her work, The Making of Haiti, in conversation with Sterling Stuckey and then other primary sources that we find will be very, very interesting. So we look forward with that. Pause for a second. Dr. Sims Alvarado couldn't be with us. She's a teaching professor. So of course she couldn't be with us today, but I just at least wanted to share, and she basically asked to share her work. And her work looks at African-American immigration during Reconstruction, immigration to Africa. So what some people call the Back to Africa movement, during Reconstruction in the state of Georgia, and the more she does research, of course, in the state of South Carolina as well. So she's synthesizing that type of research. And just to be brief, one of the things that she shows is that there's an increase from 1865 with the ending of slavery and the Civil War through 1872, the percentage of Black people in Georgia and South Carolina who actually emigrated to Liberia increased almost year after year, except for the years of 1869 and 1870. And of course, I'm sure she'll explain why there's that gap, but overall it would lead to a large plurality. The biggest plurality of Black folks who left from America were actually Gullah Geechee people. And so she actually shows that work. Next up, we're gonna have Dr. Corey Claiborne present her research. And thank you. And sorry if I went over our time limit there. Appreciate everyone.
Okay, thank you so much. I know he could really like a library in terms of this topic. I don't know, is it fine to just speak from this microphone? All right, so I will try to be brief, as we all say, but you know, we're professors and we're used to captive audiences. But I want to talk about the water, right? And the stories that are in the water and about the water. All right, so the title of my paper is The Water Always Remembers, Stories of Origin and Rebellion in South Carolina. Okay, go ahead. And I start off with a quote from Toni Morrison. She says, you know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding, it is remembering. Remembering where it used to be, because, and this is the important part, she says, all water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. And I think that that is what is true, especially, you know, when we talk about, well, how can we know more about Native American and African American, ancestry, history in places like South Carolina when it's not, you know, they're not written records. And I really believe that the landscape is really the key to understanding that, right? I think that our history is written there. I know a lot of people are from Charleston, or any of these areas, like you can go somewhere and you literally feel the people, right? You could go to St. Simon's Island where the Evo landing is, and you literally on the wind hear whispered, like the water, you know, brought us and the water can take us home, right? Like, and I think that that's really important. Okay, next slide. So, and this is a lot of words, and I just put it in there so people have it. So I'm not going to necessarily read it, but to give you a background. So Ross Michael Brown says, we are the land of the living and the land of the dead is the same place, right? And what I think is really important is to understand first how we talk about this place. So I start with looking at the fictional treatment of 1526, and the only fictional novel that I know actually deals with this, and this is by William Gilmore Simms. He was considered for really the first half of the 20th century to be the preeminent historian in South Carolina. And so he writes a romance of what he calls the Spanish coming and ultimately being defeated by the Indians. But it's very interesting in his romance, right, that which is in this collection called The Wigwam and the Cabin from 1845, that he leaves off the fact that Africans were there, right? So essentially what happened is that there was a Native American man who'd been enslaved, and this is the history, we've been enslaved by the Spanish, and he convinces the Spanish to come back to North America, promising them gold, the fountain of youth. They think they're gonna get all these riches. But Chicora is his name, is very smart. And actually he tricks the Spanish to bring him back to his people. As soon as they land near Georgetown, he's like ghost. They don't see him anymore. He goes off to his people. But here are the Spanish, they're like, okay, well now we got to figure out what to do. So he was very smart. But William Gilmore Simms sees this whole Francisco de Chicora. He invents a whole life around him, and he names his wife, Chicora's wife, and this is not true, but this is what William Gilmore Simms makes up in his romance. He calls her Cumbihi, or Cumbi as the Gullahs say, and he names her after the river. And this is going to be important because she becomes a symbol of resistance. When the Spanish try to enslave her, she jumps off the water like a mermaid that you hear in African lore. And she goes back and basically decides to burn the settlement down, send all the Spanish back, and she becomes the hero of the narrative. But I think it's really interesting that, like I said, that we don't have any Africans there. But what does the Combahee River ultimately tell us about the history of Black people in America? And we can go to the next slide, and I can just show a little bit of the wigwam in the cabin. Sam. So this is the original collection, and you'll see that, you know, it's this kind of notion that this European man is sort of carrying one of the Native men, and it really was, he felt like Sims felt like the most valor could be found in the way that the Native and the European relationship sort of happened after the Spanish, right? Like, so when the European, but when the English come, he's saying that that's when, you know, true partnership came. All right, but he does vilify the Spanish. All right, next slide. So back to Combahee. Oh, here we go. Oh, it's fading. That's exciting. You see a lot of things that sort of come into this idea of rivers. And I don't have time, but hopefully you'll get our book when it's published and you can read more about this. But you see a lot of narratives, some fiction, some nonfiction, that pick up what I say, kind of the water as sites of resistance in different ways. Like the Book of Negroes, which was written by Lawrence Hill, was also a miniseries on BET. It deals with, you know, a woman named Aminata who's brought from like Gambia and Senegal. She's enslaved in St. Helena Island, right? And her whole story is about kind of finding that water path back to her homeland, right? Gullah Days, it kind of also talks about, it's a history of Hilton Head, but it is also about how people had to know, and this is understudied, about how much Africans in America relied on like maritime knowledge. They knew how to swim, they knew how to make boats. When the Civil War started, they knew immediately that they needed to meet up in Hilton Head, right? Because they can form some kind of enclave. So it is about resistance, right? And then finally, Eric Crawford's book about spirituals, like spirituals of resistance, again at the site of St. Helena. And it becomes interesting. And I thought back to Combahee or Combahee. So if you go to the last slide, and this will conclude my presentation. So the river always keeps on rolling. So if we want to find the story of resistance for African and Native Americans in South Carolina, I think ultimately we need to think about what happens at the site of those rivers. So the Combahee is a woman in William Goodmore Sims who sort of leads the revolt. Combahee is also, it is the river that people send notes up. They call it the fishing net. Like if you wanted to know anything, they would like, oh, put the note in the fishing net and you can get it to your people. You can find your family. In the Book of Negroes, it is the battle in the Revolutionary War where John Lawrence is killed. And I always tell my students, like, you love Hamilton, you know, that's Anthony Ramos in Hamilton, but it's kind of this idea that he becomes, you know, this great figure, but he sort of dies at the bank of the same river. This is the river where Harriet Tubman, you know, famously led her raid that frees approximately 750 people. It is also in 1974, the place where the Combahee River Collective, a group of radical feminists, take their name, still resistance, still picking up this sound of the water. And if you think about the fact that the Combahee River empties out in the St. Helena Sound, and we think about the Penn School as a site of resistance and everything that comes out of that, you see that this story will keep on going, and it's up to us to make sure we listen. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I start, I feel it's really important to talk about my entry into this work. So during my graduate studies, I worked as a research assistant for Dr. Mary Ziegler, who is focused on the lexical heritage of the Gullah Geechee people. And oftentimes we'd go over to Sapelo Island and talk with our ancestor, Cornelia Walker Bailey, and no relation. I know you guys can see that it's Natasha Bailey Walker, but it's not the same person. Don't worry about it. And do this sort of storytelling where we would just listen to them talk and absorb these things. And there were some issues in relationship to understanding them, but I didn't really have a problem understanding them. And I couldn't figure out kind of what it was. Like the lilt was different, but I wasn't quite sure why I could still decipher what was being said. But then when I started listening to these elders explain these holistic healing methods, it came to like a light bulb clicked off. See, I grew up in New York to Jamaican parents, but these methods of healing reminded me of summers in Jamaica with my grandparents and my granduncles and grandaunts. I was a sickly child, so like my mom would send me to Jamaica, and my grandfather would often go into the bush and pick herbs and boil them for me to drink. And they worked. They worked. They were more potent than the prescription medicines that my mom had stuffed in my luggage. They didn't have any side effects. My grandfather used to just call it bush tea. He would never really tell me what was in it. However, working with Dr. Ziegler, I realized that it was an herb called cerasee. And then I started looking at other herbs that my elders were using to keep me healthy that also exist here in the States. For example, like sorrel is what we think of as hibiscus tea here in America. It's good for your blood, by the way. I'm telling this story because it encapsulates kind of the importance of understanding the land and what grows on it and how you can use it and manipulate it to cure or to kill. So my scope of work focuses on we can go to the next slide. I'm sorry about that. So my scope of work focuses on the presence of holistic healing and spirituality in African American literature. Since most of the knowledge of Gullah Geechee ways are kind of passed down through generations from oral traditions and immersion, kind of the same way that my grandfather explained, I go into the bush and I snip the ones that look like this. This is how most people learn how these herbs do what they do. But there have been few pieces of literature that give a glimpse into how nature contributes to retention of the traditional ways of the Gullah Geechee people. And excuse me for that. I want to address how the landscape within Gloria Naylor's Mama Day connects with the healing and spirituality of Gullah Geechee culture. I'm using eco-criticism. So the study of literature through the ways in which the environment is presented, used or abused, and how it kind of impacts the stories or the characters. So it's really important to start thinking about the land, especially given, our time period where our understanding of the environment, we're becoming more and more concerned about our environment. So in Recovering the Conjure Woman, Text and Context in Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, Lindsay Tucker asserts that, quote, Miranda's lifelong acquaintance with the woods is, to a large extent, responsible for her impressive knowledge. You could go to the next slide, please. So for those of you who might not be familiar with Mama Day, it's a Gloria Naylor book. If you're not familiar with Gloria Naylor, you might know Women of Brewster's Place. We are introduced to the oldest living citizens of this fictional island, Willow Springs, an island off the coast. Miranda and Abigail, they can trace their lineage all the way back to Sapphire, an enslaved woman who we don't quite know how, but she gains the island for newly freed Blacks. Miranda, who's known as Mama Day, uses her deep knowledge of the island's history and the island's landscape to protect and save her family. This is all while she's trying to destroy this curse of these generations of people dying and then dying of heartbreak. So she's breaking this generational curse. So I'm using the lens of eco-criticism, and I believe that the Gullah Geechee relationship to the land is sacred. And I think it's evidenced by the people today who are fighting to preserve their acres, their properties, their homes, keeping away these developers from their birthright. So in texts like Mama Day, the importance of the land is to heal its people becomes a constant theme throughout. So here's the thing. Healing in the diaspora is more than just healing the body. It's also about healing the spirit. Some illnesses are natural, some occult, some spiritual. And I'm really excited because Ife Tayo her work is going to dovetail so perfectly with my chapter in terms of what she's working on in relationship to the spirituality of the Gullah Geechee people. But these illnesses are always cured based on historical knowledge and what is found on the land. Historical knowledge is part of the healer's necessary repertoire. Just like the doctors that we go to might need an understanding of the medical history of a group of people, like Blacks might be more prone to high blood pressure or hypertension. The root doctor has to know how these people have thrived in this particular area, what grows there, what experiences they've survived, and how these things may help or complicate the treatment that this root doctor is going to provide. In Gullah people and their African heritage, William Pulitzer spends a significant portion of his book addressing the connections between health, spirit, and the plants of the land. He says, quote, medicine and religion are so intertwined that it's hard to draw a line between plants with sound scientific basis for their action and those that drive out an evil spirit. Of the vast number of herbs and shrubs long tried in Africa for healing, recent study has demonstrated therapeutic properties for many. So by mapping these Southern plants to their African plant origins is still being studied. What is clear is that the knowledge is firmly lodged in the collective wisdom of the Gullah Geechee people. And we see that as presented in Mama Day's piece. So this really is looking at it from an eco-critical lens. I want to spend a lot of time on the land, what grows there, how people know what works. The natural environment not only acts as a center of these communities, but that the healers, aptly named root doctors, are instrumental to everyday Geechee life, as well as being vital during crisis. The root doctors, now this is when I was working with Dr. Ziegler. She created what she called the Saltwater Geechee Lexical Heritage Dictionary. And she defines root doctors as figures who use roots, herbs, and plants for their medicinal and spiritual properties. Though the dictionary makes very little distinction between the root doctor and the root worker, I met a medicine man in the Geechee Kunda village, and he made a clear line between them. So his idea is that a root doctor uses his knowledge of plants for healing. The root worker focuses heavily on spiritual fixes. This point is important as the root doctor may be called for preventative medicine, health maintenance, immediate cures, but the root doctor or, a conjureman or a conjurewoman might be called on for spiritual matters, relationship problems, or luck. And this, once again, brings me back to my grandfather making bush tea, because he also used to have a little herbal talisman that he would carry around with him that he would never really talk about. You weren't supposed to touch it. You weren't even really supposed to see it. But I'm definitely going to leave that to my colleague. So the point is that Miranda Day is the center of this work. Her spiritual knowledge and relationship to the land eclipses all of the other characters of the novel. I mean, she can walk through that if she was blindfolded. And she shows how proximity to the land empowers her. By staying connected to the land, Miranda taught holistic, historical, and supernatural lessons, making her hold the role of both root doctor and root worker. Now, why is this important? This is important because this connects back to both what Dr. Claiborne said and what Dr. Livingston said. Tucker makes mention of this in her article. She says, Willow Springs, this fictional island, acts as a great setting for the matriarch, Mama Day. She says, quote, Naylor's choice of location has obviously been dictated by the historical relationship of the islands to a perpetuation of African culture, for the Sea Islands are the most African places in America. Its African nature is significant because the main character is imbued with not only healing power, but conjuring power, one that is associated with African identity. So the connection to the landscape affords these characters in Willow Springs in the text of Mama Day a deeper familiarity with their Africanness and their conjure power. And since the center of these ideas is that our living spaces hold significance, as well as how we create or tweak these spaces, then the lens of eco-criticism is necessary because it sheds light on how the landscape works to initiate Mama Day into the revered role of a root woman. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oops, that was the wrong button. So Miranda of Mama Day is a repository of historical knowledge from the lives of her ancestors to healing properties of the soils. And she, like other root women, acquire this knowledge by quite simply communing with the land. Miranda is called on for counsel because of her connection to Willow Springs. Spirituality and herbal knowledge, it seems, are inextricably tied. In a peculiar place, in a peculiar people, slave religion and community culture amongst the Gullahs, Margaret Washington Creel writes that the culturally and geographically isolated Black population, whose main spiritual tradition still rested on Africanity, has been shown only lukewarm interest for some time. I think that it's time to show true interest in how the land has created a space for both healing and a crafting of a unique faith to take root. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Oh, I'm sorry. Next, I'm trying to get rid of my echo. Here we go. We'll have Professor Carrie Dennison Elliott, Director and Founder of the Family Tree Research and Development Center, for their presentation, From These Roots. And I'll let her give the full title.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? I'd like to thank Dr. Livingston for inviting me to participate in this project, as well as being here at this conference today to share with you all the work that I'm doing, looking at one particular community in the North Santee community of Georgetown, South Carolina, and how our African retentions, especially from 15th and 16th African communities or ethnic identities, are born into the way in which communities become these safe spaces for us to grow and thrive and to be in this world. As the title of my project is From These Roots, growing up in the North Santee community of Georgetown, South Carolina, and Sam can attest to this, number one, trees are everywhere. But most importantly, there was the big tree, or the old tree, down at our grandmother's house, where we would gather, we would play, a large canopy where it protected us, it provided shade for us, but it was also a landmark as to where we were with regard to being in the family. You know, when you played hide and seek as kids, you went to the big tree to do the counting. But one of the things that has happened in my life as I've grown and I've worked in the field of social work is that trees in and of themselves, let me start there, have roots, as we all know. And from these roots, what they do is they reach down into the soil to pull up the nutrients and the nutrients that it will need in order for the tree itself to grow and thrive. But also trees, as we look at them, are all the time communicating ways in which to protect one another. There's an author by the name of Susan Simard. She's actually an ethnobiologist, but Susan Simard wrote a book called Finding the Mother Tree, where she talks about the ways in which trees, when there is an invasion that comes from some type of fungus or some type of pathological element, and a tree is dying, it will emit a signal to the other trees in its community to let them know to put on their own protective barriers, or to start the chemical process to put on these protective barriers so that they will not be affected by that same organism. And so this idea that the trees are communicating with one another about how we are to protect themselves has always been very, very interesting to me in the work that I do in the field of social work. But the roots of the tree are fascinating, not just because they bring nourishment and they send it out and so that the tree grows, but the fact that you don't know much about what's happening with the tree until you have a better understanding of where it's rooted, what is pulling in, where is it getting its nutrients, where is it getting its nutrients. For Africans, for the enslaved Africans of the Gullah Geechee community of Georgetown, South Carolina, they were brought from the continent of Africa with a wealth of knowledge that they were transmitting and sharing with their offspring. Even under the vicissitudes of slavery, they had this identity where they shared information about survival, about how to be and how to resist this very strange and what they call a peculiar system in which they found themselves. And so this particular chapter, you can go ahead and hit the next slide. This particular chapter is going to really explore these framing questions. You know, how did Africans live in freedom before enslavement? What was it like in the Senegambia region? What was it like in the various, among the Wolof or the Igbo or the Bambara people, the Mandinka? What did they learn about how to organize a community? What did they learn about what leadership in a community was? Again, as a macro social worker, these things are very, very important to helping communities to be self-sufficient and self-righteous. Again, the North Santee community, from as far as I remember as a child, always was self-sufficient. 12 miles outside of Georgetown, we had entrepreneurs, we had folks who were connected in the legislature, folks who were in the military. We had social support organizations and networks. Of course, we had churches, but all of these things provided something for folks to move forward and not be defined by the remnants of slavery, what slavery had been and what had happened. And so again, how are those sociocultural retentions demonstrated, not just in Gullah Geechee culture, but in the ways we go about ensuring that we are able to have our own agency and our own self-direction in the development of our communities. And so what we'll do, you can go to the next slide, Sam. And so what we'll be doing is really looking at the ways of synthesizing data from the fields of archaeology, some of the slave narratives, some of the notices that were sent out about where where enslaved Africans actually came from, their ethnic origins and those practices, and looking at the ways in which we see that still manifest today in the North Santee community of Georgetown, South Carolina. So again, this transfer of information, for the nourishment and survival of community is so important. We have to disrupt this idea that Africans or people of African descent have no origin story, that we have no roots, that somehow or another the experience of slavery in and of itself has totally rendered Africa null and void in the reality of our daily lives. We come from the place where knowledge and community building is ancient. It is where it all began. It is where people understood democracy and the things that we think are these new occurrences were happening long in Africa, long before even Europeans had begun. And so to engage in them. And so hopefully with this work, I'll be able to bring forth further information that really strengthens our ideas about the importance of standing in and rooting ourselves in our ethnic identity and understanding some of the things that we learn from on high in the ancients, and transmitting that information to today for the survival and the resistance of all. So thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. And I'm calling her. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Great. Next, we will have, I'm calling her Carrie. She is my cousin, and I don't have any sisters, so she's like a little sister to me. But at the same time, she is Professor Denison Elliott. And I thought I was a demanding professor, but she is definitely very engaging and challenging with her students. So I'm really looking forward to this work. Next, we have Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade, and she will be presenting, okay, transition, here we go. She will be presenting on her chapter, which is titled, When They Go Low, We Conjure, Root Work, Magic, and Ancestral Reverence Among the Gullah Geechee. Thank you, Dr. Ojelade.
Thank you, Dr. Livingston. I want to first just give honor to you for inviting me to participate in this important work and for pulling this together. As I hear each author talk, and as I have been part of the process, I've gotten more and more excited. And I also want to just acknowledge Dr. Claiborne for going to South Carolina so she can represent the group. So thank you for that. It's also important just for me, before I start talking, I want to acknowledge the fact that I am in Muskogee territory here, and that many people across the country are also on land that is unceded, often stolen and occupied. That land is of First Nations or Indigenous people and of Gullah people. And I think it's important, because we're going to talk about this subject, for us to acknowledge that at the forefront. And I just want to talk just briefly about how this title came to me, because I think as people of African descent, part of the conversation becomes that when someone does something wrong to you, we hear that kind of mantra of when someone goes low, you go high. And that was one of the things that Michelle Obama talked about when just kind of reflecting on the constant disrespect that she and her family experienced as the first African-American family to be in the White House. And I think that that is important, that if someone does something wrong to you, that you don't necessarily get in the dirt and start, flinging mud back towards them. At the same time, I do think that there's another perspective, is that when people go low and they are harmful and they are a threat to yourself, your own safety, your family and community, that you have a right to protect yourself. And we see that in kind of an ancestral history when we can look at the Gullah people and we can see this history of root work, of magic and ancestral reverence, and be able to talk about those things as acts of resistance. If you can go to the next slide, please. And as a young person, I was really intrigued by this idea of flying Africans. And I'm sure that we've all heard of that We know from numerous stories that people talk about flying Africans. And so a famous story is about Igbo landing, but even if we look at some of the WPA interviews, you can see mentions of flying Africans constantly, and mentions of root work. And this is a formerly enslaved African that is actually out of Cuba. And I thought this quote was really interesting because basically what he's talking about is in Cuba, one of the things that the Spanish did is they stopped importing these Africans, stopped attempting to enslave these particular Africans because these Africans kept flying away. And he was just like, it was bad for business. So they had to stop. They had to go to another group of Africans to try to enslave. And that has always been really curious to me. So I've read over the years all of these stories about flying Africans. And when we talk about these stories, we talk about them in a particular way. So if we can go to the next slide. And I think what we do is because in our heads, particularly I have a PhD, so logically I'm thinking someone cannot fly. If I say the word magic, someone can't do magic. If we talk about root work, we think of that as something that is, sometimes people think of it as evil, some superstitious. I loved Dr. Walker's piece before mine, and I think I think that she's correct that our chapters will flow in together very well, because I think when we talk about these things, we're always trying to explain them away in the sense of respectability politics or just rationalizing. So when we talk about flying Africans or magic, the idea is like, well, they couldn't really fly, it was just a metaphor. Or we try to rationalize the things that they did. Well, they were poor and they didn't know any better. They didn't have a lot of education. So that was the thing that they did. And what I really want to do with this chapter, if we can move to the next slide, please, is I want to turn that on its head. And so I'm a counseling psychologist. And so what I want to do is use a counseling psychologist or an African-centered psychological lens and re-examine some of these stories when we talk about root work, when we talk about why people use ancestral reverence, when we talk about the idea that if you did something to some of these enslaved Africans, then they may engage in conjure to protect themselves. When we look at even being able to engage in revolution. So whether we think about what Dr. Livingston talked about in Haiti, but we can also just directly think about Gullah people. So we can think about Gullah Jack, we can think about Dr. Buzzard. Those are kind of big names of folks, but we can also think about it in fictional characters like Dr. Walker talked about in Mama Day. We see these characters of people that have historically protected themselves, and they've used African spirituality in ways that we don't necessarily understand from our Western mind and our Western training, but I think that there's something that needs to be examined there. And as opposed to just saying, well, the Africans can't fly. I don't know, I've never seen anybody fly. But what I do know is one of my good friends who has a PhD and she's a psychologist and she has a complete rational mind, what she would tell me is stories of watching her grandmother levitate about a foot off the ground when she was a little kid. So I think that there's a way that we can begin to talk about these things that we don't understand, that show respect and humility, as opposed to just simply going from the perspective of respectability or being dismissive of the experiences of Gullah folks, that there's these things that happen in order to resist, and we just don't understand the science or technology behind it. And I just really want to stop on that note and notice that I said the word science and technology, not superstition, not mythology, not just kind of dismissing what people have done, but recognizing that there's an African science behind the things that they did, and we just may not have the keys to be able to unlock our understanding of it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ojelade. And okay, next we will have Dr. Stephanie Dunn, who will present on her work on Gullah cultural aesthetics and the moving image as visual archive of resistance. Dr. Stephanie Dunn. And we will have to, I think she wants to show a couple of clips, but I'm going to go to the first slide and then she'll cue me when she wants to take control.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope so.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Sam Livingston and Dr. Corey Claiborne. I love you guys, and I'm so appreciative that I'm a part of this project. Thanks to you both, and for Dr. Claiborne for representing us so well and setting us up so well. So I'm just gonna share just a couple minutes of I guess, let you eavesdrop into my motivation in thinking here. So the legendary Julie Dash, and you know I can use that word, I believe, with her, can't I? Is obviously the inspiration. She has become a close spiritual sister friend, a fellow filmmaker, friend and colleague, and my admiration and my desire to make sure that we fully appreciate her contributions cinematically have only grown, of course. And I am going to jump right into, I would like to show just a little quick, if I may, at Sam. Okay. All right. I'm going to just a little tiny bit. A second here, and I will, there we go. Share my screen. There we go. Gonna take us back for a second here. Just a little bit of this. Oh, I think it's, our sound is not, although. There we go. All right. Prologue.
I'm Richard Brody, and this clip is from Daughters of the Dust, a 1991 drama directed by Julie Dash. It's one of the most daringly constructed, visually astonishing American movies of its time. It tells a direct and painful story, or rather an interwoven skein of stories, with a technique that is as aesthetically stimulating as it is historically revelatory. It's set in 1902 on St. Helena Island, off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, where the Gullah
for a
people
second,
lived.
I want
The descendants
to
of
point out
slaves, or as is said in the film,
here.
captured after.
So I just wanted to take us back for a second, of course, so we can visually see, and any excuse, I'm sure you'll agree to look at for a second any of Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust is important. But that film, which, as you know, set in 1902, Julie Dash's award-winning film, which, you know, brought her to the fore, was a film that was inspired by her father's roots in Gullah culture. And it explores the community of Gullah Geechee folks and the descendants of enslaved West Africans who, after being brought to America, somehow, you know, retain much of their West African culture and developed distinctive languages. And the film is very much about sort of the changing tides in the community, where some of the younger generation have decided to leave the island for the new home on the mainland. I want to refer to a couple of things that Julie Dash has said about the importance of her exploration into Gullah Geechee culture cinematically. She says, the more and more I learned about the Gullah Geechee culture, the more fascinated I became, because we learn to camouflage what we love and eat and our desires, how we communicate non-verbally in order to survive. I originally wrote it as a silent film because why not? I wanted the visuals to tell the story. Now, Dash has said, you know, even in recent years that, you know, the film, you know, was for so many people, quote, foreign because it introduced them to a culture that so many of them had never heard of before. Now, subsequently, in the last several years, what's been wonderful is this revival that has, I think, celebrated more this particular work of hers. There was the re-release of the film on DVD by the Coen brothers, and I was blessed to be able to do the director's cut interview with Julie Dash for that. And of course, it had a re-release in theaters, a short theatrical run in New York and other cities, and it has been celebrated and honored and reflected back on at a number of major festivals in the last 4 years alone. And it is said to have influenced Beyonce's, of course, short film with its aesthetic sensibility that people recognized as a nod to Daughters of the Dust. But what's interesting to me, and what that I am so excited that this chapter gets to highlight, is more of Julie Dash's work that also has this Gullah culture influence. So Dash is in production right now on a very exciting and important documentary about Verda Mae Smart Grosvenor, who was a world-renowned author and performer and chef, a culinary anthropologist, if you will. And, you know, the film is based upon her. You can change that slide if you still have the controls there. It's based on her remarkable Vibrations Cooking, which is a travel notes of a Geechee girl, published there. And you see it there, published 1970. Okay. And so this work inspired Julie Dash's now years-long work on a documentary about this remarkable woman's life. And she just received an NEH grant a year ago to help finish the work. And what's interesting to me is the intersections between the narrative film, the fictional film Daughters of the Dust, and now this documentary film, which highlights a Black woman of the same roots of the characters in the Daughters of the Dust. And of course, in Daughters of the Dust, we see the women, cooking, cutting okra, preparing crabs and shrimp and gumbo. And of course, Verda Mae Grosvenor provided her cooking. Her notes are infused with cultural witticisms and, insight and cultural critique, along with recipes for gumbo and the like. And I'm going to, if I can just share screen, just give a little peek at that documentary. I can just wrap up right after that. So thank you so much. All right, here we go. Let's see.
Who are you? Verda Mae Grosvenor. I said, that don't ring no bell with me.
1950s in the United States would have had a very narrow range of possibilities for a young Black woman. It wasn't a country that was ready for someone like her to be all that she could be.
In the early 60s, I got involved in the civil rights movement. And I hear, pow, 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 pow. Get out of the way, niggas.
Artists who were involved in the Black arts movement were very aware of creating politically conscious work.
Concept of developing a Black art that we did not have to imitate European culture.
Part of what they were saying is we have a culture and it is born out of the soul.
So she is using food to tell a story of a people.
It was a really refreshing thing for a person to be using cooking as a front for her activism, because she was very clear about who she was.
People always said, you need to write a cookbook.
I was very surprised that she had a book entitled Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl, because I felt she was telling the world that she was a Geechee. I had grown up believing to admit you were a Geechee was not a good thing.
What she said is that I come to you as this anthropologist
telling you about this food?
We are probably some of the only people in the world who are conflicted about the food that has allowed us to be ourselves. But that comes out of who we are. And it comes out of how we feel about enslavement.
She is embodying who the modern Black subject is.
I can't even imagine what it was like in the 1950s for Berta May to leave at age 17, 18 to get on a boat that was going to take weeks to get to Europe.
Now, why did they go to Paris? It was sort of like a beat generation environment. You were not judged on color of your skin. You were not judged on any of this. You were exotic.
See, Berta thinks outside the box. That's what Baraka did. Let's break the form. Let's break the mold. And a lot of people don't like you for that.
When people say to her, well, why are you wearing African clothes? You're not African, you're an American. And she says, I choose who I am.
One of the things that's so amazing is that she's kind of part of the cutting edge of so many forms of Black diaspora culture, right? So we see her with the Black arts movement. We see her down on the Lower East Side. We see her with these poets. And then lo and behold, with Black cinema, there she is too.
They took America on. They challenged America on every level.
What a life. And of course, the pièce de résistance, being a moon goddess with Sun Ra. That's the pièce de résistance.
Now, don't you love that? Is that not amazing? And so this chapter is going to explore Julie Dash's work in part, and I'm blessed to be able to have long, very long conversations and dialogues about the connections, of Daughters of the Dust to this work and this sort of her coming full circle with now this documentary with this early exploration that she's done. And along with the incredible documentary will be obviously very important in addition to some of the other works that we're familiar with about Daughters of the Dust, but Julie Dash's voice will be very prominent resource and this new work, this documentary, as I look at the ways in which the two films, the nonfiction film and the narrative film, really speak to the uniqueness of Gullah culture and I think really expand our understanding of the connections to space, to history, to home place, to cultural exchange. So thank you very much. I'm stop rumbling there and thank you very much.
Okay, Dr. Dunn, thank you so much. I have to say that I've had the pleasure of working with these great colleagues in developing this Gullah class. And I'm sorry, try not to have an echo. And also in writing the introduction to the text with Dr. Dunn. And so I don't want to have the last word, but thank you, everyone. I look forward to any questions or comments, or we look forward to any questions or comments that the audience might have. And that is it. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So we do have just a little bit of time for questions. We've got some in the chat, so we'll get through those first, and then we'll have some audience questions. So let us expand this. So we have some questions from Heather Hodges. And she says, this is much needed text and tool. What is Morehouse's position on developing open source curriculum versions of courses and course material?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked that because a lot of our work is digital, a lot of it is open source. We are committed.
I'm leaving that squarely in Dr. Livingston's lap.
What happened?
Dr. Claiborne, we can't really hear you. I think you're speaking from the audience.
Hold on, I'll come up here. Okay, sorry. So what we are committed at the AUC, we actually have a OER, different OER projects, but with our library, we develop open source journals, all of our material. We're really trying to make sure that it's digitized. I have a podcast I host. You see, you can go listen to it, where I talk to people about what they're doing, but the idea is that you archive this, right? So, you know, Julie Dash is at our sister school, Spelman. She does wonderful work with her students. All of that too could be stuff that you can access. So yeah, we are definitely committed to open source, open educational resources. Uh-oh, no, where am I doing? Oh, sorry.
I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the radar repository for our library.
Yeah, which is called Radar.
And basically the space where you can go to if you want material writings from me or any of our colleagues who work in the AUC schools, that you could go to our library and take a look at that.
Right. Excellent. And then I think this next question is actually for Natasha. So the scope seems to be firmly in South Carolina and to lesser extent Florida. Is work contemplated that would consider the African experience in Spanish British colonial Florida?
Okay.
And she, Heather Hodges also added that she meant South Carolina and Georgia, but she is interested on Spanish and British colonial Florida. And yes, I would love to pursue that further, especially because of the influence that comes from the Caribbean and kind of comes up the coast. So that is a great place to engage, especially if you're talking about places like St. Augustine. And I for my particular chapter, I'm lasering in on Mama Day, but I am going to talk about herbology in a broader sense in terms of that entire Gullah Geechee space, which would encompass Florida as well. I hope that answered her question.
Yeah. Okay, and we can open it up to audience members if we want to, but I have a question first. I do. I have a question for everybody first. So I'm very fascinated by this project because I'm a Mexican girl, and very rarely do Hispanic people and African-American people get connected together, yet we're always competing for the same resources. So it's always like we're pitted against each other without ever coming together. So I really find this to be a fascinating project because it's the first time I've ever seen that we're putting our histories together. So I just would like for you guys to speak. How did you come to this? How did it come to 1526 and looking at the Spanish and actually including them from the normal British narrative?
Oh, that's good. That's a Dr. Samuel Livingston question, if there ever was one. So if you want to take that.
Well, I'll be really brief. Great question. I would say, man, going back to around 1989 and looking at some of the old scrapper historians from Dr. John Henrik Clark and Apthekers and the Phoners, but they mentioned, and can't forget, Peter H. Wood, not the conservative historian Peter W. Wood, but Peter H. Wood. He talks about 1526. And, you know, so it was like a seed that was planted back like 1987 for my first reading. But I think also we got to give credit to Jack Forbes, the Native American historian, cultural anthropologist, and linguist, who wrote about the connections between Africans and Native Americans. And I really think that we're just going to have to go back and dust off some of the literature. I think just after the civil rights movement, there was a huge groundswell of literature that was trying to reimagine history, and to because it's unfortunate. We mentioned Jack Forbes or Sterling Stuckey or I started to say Allion Jope, but not Allion Jope, Sylviane Juf. Or these people don't make it into the curriculum. They don't make it into the curriculum. So we really have to push back much more firmly and let our conservative brothers and sisters know that no, we won't be editing, we won't be banning any CRT or models like that. No, we're actually pushing forward to diversify what we actually teach our kids. And I think it's really, it's gonna take re-education. I hate to say it like that. It sounds like, you know, what's that? The Maoist revolution. No, but it really is going to take re-education because we simply have displaced voices that need to be heard.
Yeah, and I just appreciate the comment that Althea Sumter just made about the fact that they have a 1526 society. But what I find really fascinating is that the story does not spread out of Beaufort County, right? Like it doesn't spread out of South Carolina. So when I say that there was literally, like we talk about La Florida, like as the, you know, settlement that goes from North Carolina out to Alabama, right? And encompasses all of that. You know, people do not know, right? Either they don't know or it conflicts with the history of what they think they know about the United States. And it's kind of like they just throw it away. So I think what we're really doing is trying to enter the 1526 narrative into conversations where it's usually not placed, right? And we actually at Morehouse have a study abroad called MPage. And it's really interesting because they went to Veracruz, Mexico, and they found that historically there were settlements of Gullah people in Veracruz, and that the Underground Railroad ran south as well as north. And it was like this whole kind of conversation about, well, why did we know about Africans, like our ancestors who went to Mexico? Why do we not talk about that? So yeah, I think it's definitely, you know, past time.
Yes. So, all right, we have a question in the audience, Mr. Red Shirt.
What's the most direct resistance that the project has received?
Have you received? Well, one of the things about being in an HBCU is like, we don't receive direct resistance. We're kind of like, okay, we're used to being the site of resistance, right? We're used to being like a Black college that has the punch above our weight, right? Like in the sense that we have wonderful narratives, you know, right across from my office is a statue of our most famous graduate, Martin Luther King, and he's like pointing at me like, you better get out there, like go talk about these things. So I do feel like, you know, I think that I don't want to, maybe Sam will talk about this. Nicole Hannah-Jones actually came to Morehouse, and even she was very useful, like it was great. She's wonderful. And she was like, well, why is it that y'all want to talk about 1526? Isn't that's not really America? We're like, no, it's South Carolina, Georgia, like Florida, that's, you know, she's like, oh yeah, but that doesn't really matter. It's like, even in somebody who's interested in this work, it's like, yeah, well, yeah, you could talk about that, but that's not really important. And I was kind of surprised, but Sam, maybe you want to say something about it?
Again, I'll be real brief. I can say Professor Jones, she was very supportive of the idea of looking at 1526. And, you know, we're not trying to be in competition with the 1619 project. We simply want to add in another set of voices and another key set of dates. And so any of my colleagues want to speak to that.
Yeah. Any other audience questions?
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Okay.
I hear you talk about re-education. I have a dear friend, a neighbor of mine, graduated high school in 1957. The day she was born until she graduated high school, she lived in Wichita. So she was born in 1940. Less than 20 years after the massacre happened. She heard about it when 60 Minutes did a story about a year and a half ago. First she'd ever heard, knew the neighborhood, knew, you know, state of the neighborhood while she was growing up. Never heard about the massacre. No one talked about it. So, you know, doesn't take long for history to get there.
No, I mean, they don't, my students don't know what happened yesterday. I'll be like, did you look up, you know, they're like, what? Like that happened. It is amazing. It doesn't take long. And it's really also the language we use when we talk about things, right? So when people, you know, it depends on the way you say it, how they pay attention and put it into their own narratives. Because what we want to be very clear, like this is, we say, you know, African-American history, African-American, Africana studies, but this is America's story. This is all of our narratives. And we all need to be clear because we are all here together. I always tell people, Harriet Tubman is my hero, but it should be everybody's hero because she fought for freedom and she can be a model for everybody. It's not just us. So yeah, this is about our story. So I appreciate it.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but these were fantastic presentations. I'm really so excited to have this here at Coastal Carolina University. So great. And everybody, if you want their information, it's some of this stuff is in the chat.
Yes.
And you can definitely reach out to everybody if you have further questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Real quick, can I shout out to Allie Crandall, shout out to Eric Crawford, to Dr.
everybody
Gerald
at Coastal.
and Coastal Carolina University. Go Gamecocks though. Okay, sorry for that little salt right there, but thank y'all for the work that you do.
Guys. I actually never told you guys my name, by the way. I'm Alicia Topete Cromwell. I'm assistant professor here at Coastal, and I do African American studies. I'm one of the only Mexicans I know that does African American history. So I forgot to tell you guys that. I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.
And thanks to my panelists. Great work, guys.